This is segment 2 of the video discussion on chapter 5, language. We've looked at the nature of language. Now we get on to the impact of language. We'll look at the many ways that language can impact our lives. The first one is naming and identity. So a name is more than just a simple means of identification. They shape the way others think of us, the way we view ourselves, and the way we act. And so early studies claim that people with non-normative, extraordinary, unusual names suffered every day from psychological and emotional disturbance to failure in college. It's interesting. Didn't know that would happen. Some people, on the other hand, regard unique names as very distinctive, and it just makes them stand out in the crowd. In one study, a poem signed with an unusual name was assessed as more creative than when signed by a more common name. Sometimes the name that we use is connected with our cultural identity. The second one is affiliation. Language can build and demonstrate a certain amount of solidarity with others. So we adapt our speech in a variety of ways to show our connection with, our affiliation with someone else, a group maybe. Let's look at that more individually. Close friends and lovers often develop a set of special terms that serve as a way of signifying and cementing their relationship. And this is called convergence. Convergence is the process of adapting one's speech style to match that of others with whom you want to identify. Convergence. When two or more people feel equally positive about each other, their linguistic convergence will be more mutual. But when one communicator wants or needs approval, convergence is more one-sided. So communicators who want to set themselves apart from others adopt the strategy of divergence, speaking in a way that emphasizes difference rather than commonality. So we need to be careful when and when not to converge language. One of the pragmatic goals of divergence is the creation of norms about who may use certain words and who may not. If you're part of the in-group, you can use those certain words. If you're not part of that in-group and you try to converge, you may be looked on as negatively. Power and politeness. There are a number of language patterns that communicate either more power or less power. So powerless language is the first one. And this is when you and I use tentative, indirect word choices with hedges and hesitations. For example, excuse me, sir, I guess, okay. Powerless language versus powerful language. Here the language is more direct and forceful with declarations and assertions, no hedges, no hesitation. So studies show that people who use powerful speech are rated as more competent, dynamic, and attractive than speakers who sound powerless. So, in an employment interview that you might be going into, a powerful speech style results in a more powerful or positive attribution of competence. They'll see you as being more competent, more employable than if you use powerless language. A disclaimer is a type of powerless speech that attempts to distance a speaker from some remarks that might be unwelcome. So you might say something to the effect, I don't mean to sound judgmental, but, and then you go to express your disapproval. One study showed that disclaimers, if you make that disclaimer, it actually increases negative judgments from the other person. So they backfire because they sensitize the listener to look for and find the very quality of judgmentalness that you are trying to disavow. So some scholars question the label powerless because tentative and indirect speech styles can sometimes achieve goals far better than more assertive approaches. Less forceful approaches can be attempts at politeness. It's a way of saving face for both sender and receiver. And of course, for high context culture, saving face is a very important thing, such as a Middle Eastern and Asian context. Communicators in Japan, for example, tend to speak in ambiguous terms and use hedge words and qualifiers. And they use it to smooth over interpersonal relationships. Sometimes social rules often mask the real distribution of power. So a boss who wants to be pleasant might say, "Would you mind getting this file?" Both the boss and the administrative assistant know that this is not a request, it is a command, it's something that they should do, but it's trying to save face and respect the person, the subordinate person's position. So, politeness can be a face-saving way of delivering an order. And so you might say, maybe it would be a good idea too, or it would be great if you... And of course, it depends on the person that you are speaking to. Somebody on the other side might take it as a request when you mean it as an order. So you have to know whom you're speaking to and use their language to get what you want, really. So high status speakers, especially higher status women, often realize that politeness is an effective way to get their needs met while protecting the dignity of the less powerful person. So what you do achieve here is two things: what you want, the content, but also you preserve the relationship. And of course, that's probably the best way. That's the best way to do what you need to do in order to get what you want. The key thing here is adapting your language usage to suit your conversational partner. If the other person perceives indirectness as being weak, then you need to shift the way you speak so that they will understand that you are in control and that you are the more powerful speaker. Sexism and racism. Sexist language includes words, phrases, and expressions that unnecessarily distinguish or differentiate between males and females, or exclude or trivialize or diminish either sex. And of course, this affects the self-concept of both women and men. So you can look at the actual little assessment on sexist language and complete it to discover how much sexist language you use or you don't use. For example, to say that a woman mothered her children focuses on her nurturing behavior, but to say that a man fathered a child talks only about his biological role. So not only does it stereotype, but sexist language can stigmatize women. So we often speak of an unmarried mother, but we never speak of an unmarried father. So there are two ways to eliminate sexist language. The first circumvents the problem altogether by eliminating sex-specific terms or substituting neutral terms. So instead of saying chairman or chairwoman, you say a chairperson. The second way is to mark sex clearly. And here you say chairman, or if you're referring to a male, you say chairwoman if you're referring to a female. Racist language reflects a worldview that classifies members of one racial group as superior and another as inferior. Now, not all language has racist overtones. Very often, the words we use that seem to have racist overtones. So we speak of Black Monday, Black Plague, Black Cats, Black Market. They all have negative connotations. So an obvious way toward eliminating racist language is to make sure your communication is free of offensive labels and slurs. And very often, you don't have to indicate race. You don't have to say it's a white or Asian or Hispanic professor. Just say it's a professor. Precision and vagueness. Most people assume that the goal of language is to make our ideas clear to one another. When clarity is the goal, then that's what we do. We want to make our ideas understandable to the other person. Sometimes we want to be less than perfectly clear, and vagueness serves a useful purpose. And so we will use ambiguous language where the word can have more than one commonly accepted definition. You know what that is. The responsibility for interpreting statements rests both with the speaker and the listener, especially the listener, the receiver. And so the listener might say, I'm not sure I understand the term the way you do. May I paraphrase? May I question to clear up some misunderstanding? Abstractions are convenient ways of generalizing about similarities between several objects, people, ideas, or events. So we use higher level abstractions all the time. And we do them sometimes to save face, to avoid confrontation, and to avoid embarrassment. So if somebody wants your opinion about something and it doesn't sound like a great opinion, you might say, well, I never thought of it that way. Overly abstract language can lead to stereotyping. Very often, abstract statements will soften the blow of critical messages. But people who use vague language to describe others' negative actions are rated as less likable than those who use concrete language. So sometimes it seems to backfire. So you can make your language and your thinking less abstract and more clear by learning to form behavioral descriptions of your problems. So look at the table 5.1, and I'm no good at meeting strangers. Well, what exactly do you mean by that? Well, people are like to date, parties in schools. What do I think? They never want to date me. I don't initiate conversations. And so you find out here when you delve more into it and come up with a behavioral description, it's much easier to understand what the person means by what they say. Euphemism is when you substitute innocuous terms for blunt ones. So instead of saying she died, you might say she passed away. In South Africa, they might say that person is late. He's late, meaning that he'll never be on time anymore. He's late. He has died. They tend to soften the impact of information that might be unpleasant, both for yourself and for the person. So we tend to use euphemisms more when talking with people of higher status, probably as a way of not offending them. So be careful when you decide to use euphemisms. The challenge is to be kind without sacrificing either your integrity or the clarity of your message. Relative language gains meaning by using comparison, and of course that's a great way to compare things. A comparison has a way of helping us clearly understand what you mean. So turn your word into something that's measurable, put it into a number, quantify it. Certainly does help. Evaluative language seems to describe something, but really announces the speaker's attitude toward it. For example, if you say, if you approve of somebody, you might say they're thrifty, but if you disapprove, you might say they are cheap. If you approve of someone and their actions, you might say they are traditional, but if you disapprove, you might say they are old-fashioned. So look at the section on evaluative language. The language of responsibility. This reflects the speaker's willingness to take responsibility for her or his beliefs, feelings, and actions. So instead of using it statements, use I statements. It's worrying when you're late. Instead of saying that, say I'm worried when you are late. Instead of saying it's a bad idea, you might say I don't think that's a good idea. So I language clearly identifies the speaker as the source of the message. The speaker takes ownership of his or her feelings and behaviors. But statements, X but Y, can be confusing. It has sometimes the effect of canceling the thought that precedes it. You're really a great person, but I think we ought to stop seeing each other. But can be a face-saving strategy at times and worth using. But sometimes it tends to backfire. So break statements such as the preceding one into 2 sentences and then explain each one separately as necessary. I, you, and we language. So you language expresses a judgment of the other person's actions or behavior. Positive judgments really cause problems, but if it's a negative judgment, it will cause interpersonal issues. You left this place in a mess, you didn't keep your promise, you're really crude sometimes. So you language arouses defensiveness. It implies that the person who's making the statement is qualified to judge the other person. I language provides a more accurate and less provocative way to express the same thing, to express a complaint. So by using I language, you describe your reaction to someone's behavior, taking responsibility for your statement and for your reaction. And it's a way of clearly expressing your thoughts, feelings, and wants. So when you use assertive messages and when you use I statements, it's made up of three different components. The first one describes describes the other person's behavior. The second one describes your feeling, and the third one describes the consequences the other person's behavior has upon you. So I get embarrassed, you're feeling, when I hear you talk about my grades in front of our friends, the behavior you observed. I'm afraid they'll think I'm stupid, the possible consequences. So even sometimes the best constructed and best delivered I message won't always receive a non-defensive response. People will get defensive anyway. And that is because nobody welcomes hearing that his or her behavior is causing someone else a problem. And if you use too much I language, you might sound very egotistical. Research shows that self-absorbed people, known as conversational narcissists, can be identified by their constant use of I language, first person I. So one way of avoiding I language, or using it excessively, is to consider the pronoun we. We language implies that the issue is the concern and responsibility of both the speaker and the receiver of message. So it helps to build a constructive language. It has the idea of we're in this together. It's verbal immediacy is what they refer this we are together orientation to as. Couples who use we language are often satisfied and manage conflict better than those who rely more heavily on I and you. On the other hand, using we can sound presumptuous and even demanding because now you're speaking for the other person as well as for yourself. So as you look at the table 5.2, you can see that I, you, and we have advantages and disadvantages. So if your I language reflects your position without being overly self-absorbed, drawing too much attention to yourself, your you language shows concern for others without judging them, and your we language includes others without speaking for them, then you'll really be using language well in interpersonal communication. The next video segment, we will look at gender and language.